Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line on TVP World. This is where we unpack the main business and economic stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Cato. The US tariffs on steel and aluminium have taken effect on Wednesday in another chapter of a spiraling trade war, which has engulfed half of the world, changing the face of the global economy. Before we get into the significance of all of this, let's take a look at the feature that our reporter Ian Kennedy has got for us today.
The global trade war is heating up. Starting Wednesday, all aluminium and steel imports to the US will be subject to a 25% tariff. Introduced by the new administration in Washington, this move has sparked a wave of responses from around the world.
As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States.
And others followed suit.
China will also take necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests.
China has already responded with 2 rounds of tariffs in retaliation to 2 duties hikes ordered by Trump, which amount to 20% on top of the duties the president imposed during his first term. In early February, Beijing slapped tariffs on American LNG and agriculture machinery, and in early March on agriculture products like soybean and beef. Another front in the trade war involves Canada and Mexico. Trump has said that all imports from neighbouring countries will be subject to 25% tariffs, with some exceptions. The tariffs were set to come into force in March after being postponed for a month. But last week, Trump decided to delay them until April, citing the USMCA free trade agreement. This prompted Mexico to stand firm.
We do not tax products that come from the United States because we have a trade agreement. So if we do not tax what comes from the United States, then the United States will also not tax what comes from Mexico because it is reciprocity.
Canada, however, is the leading exporter of aluminium and steel to the US market and has responded by announcing 25% tariffs of its own, with plans for harsher measures next week.
We're in a kind of trade war. I think what the US is trying to do is use tariffs to gain leverage, particularly over trading partners it sees as disadvantaging itself.
When it comes to steel, after Canada, America imports most from Brazil and Mexico. Here in Europe, Germany and the Netherlands will be most affected. However, Poland's steel industry will remain intact as the country consumes more steel than it manufactures.
As trade unionists working in Polish steel plants, we're currently not concerned about the effects of enormous tariffs the Americans are going to impose.
However, the automotive industry could face a greater impact. Poland, along with other countries in the region, is a significant producer of car components. And it's not the end, as Trump has already pledged to slap European goods, including cars, with 25% tariffs from April.
Lots of our suppliers supplying the German OEMs, and Germany with Italy or also Slovakia exports a lot of vehicles to the US. So through Germany, our companies will be impacted.
The US president seems to be convinced that the tariffs will rejuvenate manufacturing in the country.
The tariffs are having a tremendously positive impact. They will have, and they are having. We have car companies that are not building in Mexico now. They're building in the United States. Some of them, the plants were already started and they stopped construction, and now they're going to build in the United States.
Despite Trump's optimism, the auto industry has a different perspective, and analysts agree that in the end it is the consumer who will bear the brunt of these costs.
CEO of General Motors said that they would really have to undertake strategic maneuvers, and even then they could probably only dodge 50% of the damage from the tariffs. The Peterson Institute, which is supposed to be a nonpartisan think tank, estimates that if we get these 25% tariffs, it will hit the average household to the tune of about $1,800 per year.
Nevertheless, countries remain hopeful that Trump's tariffs are merely a bargaining tool, and his business-oriented approach will lead to exemptions. And so far, the US's biggest trading partner is keeping its cool.
China is not overreacting. I think China is trying to take some time to understand exactly what's going on and also find ways to respond in kind, but without hurting its overall exports.
For now, however, uncertainty persists.
Tariffs and a protectionist trade policy have been a part of President Donald Trump's presidency since day one of his second term. Today, we want to take a look at how it may play out in the coming weeks and months and the impact it will have on the global economy. For that, we are joined by Ian Begg, professor at European Institute at the London School of Economics. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Good afternoon.
So for the longest time, there have been concerns about the impact of Trump's tariffs, but we actually see some members of the American business industry who are pleased with what is happening. So is there a chance that perhaps Donald Trump has his countrymen's best interests at heart after all?
It depends on which country people you refer to, because there are always going to be some winners from tariffs and there are always going to be some losers from it. So it's a balancing act. On the whole, consumers will tend to lose. Certain manufacturers will have to pay more for components in their supply chain. They will lose. But companies which are competing with the imports, on the whole, might win because there is a benefit to them. And it may also be the case that very heavy tariffs will add to the revenue coming into the US Treasury because it's a form of tax, an import tax.
Donald Trump is certain that the tariffs on steel and aluminium imposed on Canada and Europe will benefit the US industry significantly. And this wasn't necessarily the case during his previous term. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Well, if American consumers or business users of steel and aluminium are currently buying from elsewhere, it's because it's on more favorable terms. If they have to switch to domestic producers in the US, at the first level, at least, is going to be switching to a more expensive supplier. So that's not necessarily good news for those users of the metals. It may be good for the producers of the metals, but not necessarily good for the users. Trade economists have long used an expression which I think tries to capture this, which is trade diversion. You switch from relatively low-cost supplier to a relatively higher-cost supplier, and you're diverting trade in that way, in some cases, back to your domestic producers.
At the same time, the US is slapping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, and the EU. Where will this end, do you think?
Well, here you've got to be rather cynical and say it probably depends which side of the bed Donald Trump gets out of each morning. One morning it's a big tariff increase, the next morning he cuts the tariffs. So we just cannot predict what this unpredictable individual is going to do next. However, it's also worth mentioning that trade policy in a typical system in the US relies on Congress, not just on executive orders by the president. And at some stage, his continuing resort to executive orders is going to be queried, including possibly by the courts, as well as by members of Congress, if they decide at some stage that they're going to grow some backbone and resist what the president is doing.
But you mentioned Donald Trump's unpredictability. But looking at what he's been doing since he's returned to the White House, what do you think Trump's endgame might be in all this?
Who knows? It's really impossible to tell because he's using tariffs for two completely different reasons. One is to exert pressure on trading partners for reasons that are nothing to do with economics. You remember the first stage of this was pressure on the Mexicans and the Canadians about securing the border, stopping the flows of migrants, allegedly trying to reduce the flow of fentanyl into the US. In other cases, it's purely economic. He thinks that he can enable American producers to benefit by freezing out through high tariffs those producers from other parts of the world. Now, even for the US, if there is retaliatory action, as has been announced today by Ursula von der Leyen on behalf of the European Commission, American exporters are going to lose from that. American sellers of bourbon, one of the things that's being targeted, will say, right, we can no longer sell to Europe, so what are we going to do? We're losing a significant market. So there are winners and losers in all this. And the idea that it's a unilateral decision by Trump, which is going to lead to unilateral gains for the United States, is just fantasy.
Speaking of winners and losers, I just wanted to go back to 2020 for a moment. Just to quote Trump, in a true sense, it's also a partnership with Mexico and Canada and ourselves against the world. And this is referring to a moment when he signed a US-Mexico-Canada agreement. And what we see him doing now is actually taking apart this alliance for the benefit of rebuilding the American economy. It seems like a very radical thing to do. What do you think of this? What are your comments?
Well, it's radical, and one upshot of the deal that he signed in his first presidency was that Mexico and Canada maybe benefited more than the US, at least in sales and manufactures. But there's also the service sector to consider, and the US is a net exporter to the rest of the world of services. So again, you need to look at it in far more detail. But what he's also doing with that decision on Mexico and Canada is disrupting not just a trade deal that he had negotiated, which itself was a renegotiation of the existing North America Free Trade Area, NAFTA. He's also disrupting the global trading system. It's undercutting the World Trade Organization, which is supposed to be the global regulator of how trade flows happen. And years and years, decades, even centuries of economic analysis tells us that a free trading system is win-win for everybody. What Trump is doing is going to be maybe, in some cases, to the benefit of American producers, less so for American consumers, but is going to damage certain other parts of the world. And if they retaliate, it can become a spiral which is completely negative, as happened in the 1930s when it was associated with the Great Depression.
I wanted to now move on to how the world is reacting to these US tariffs. We hear that Europe is going to impose counter tariffs in April worth 28 billion euros. Canada is responding in a similar fashion. Mexico said it won't retaliate. China, as we've heard in the report, is taking a measured stance. What are your thoughts and comments in regards to this?
Well, the retaliation is to make it clear to Trump that it's not all one way. It was pretty obvious that the European Commission would have been planning a whole series of interventions, and they're going to be targeted at things like, what I mentioned earlier, the sales of bourbon whiskey, the sales of Harley-Davidson motorcycles, as happened last time around when Trump was president. And what's maybe significant is these are areas that tend to be Republican strongholds in the US political system. Republican senators, Republican Congress people are going to be saying, wait a minute, you are now damaging my constituents, which is one area where the backlash can come not just between the United States and the European Union, but also within the United States, where some of the industries affected are going to be saying, this is not good for us. Why are you doing this?
EU Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, Markos Sefcovic, shared the details of his efforts to negotiate a deal with the US. I just wanted to show you what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
I was seeking constructive dialogue to avoid the unnecessary pain of measures and countermeasures. We jointly identified a few areas that would allow us to move forward by fostering mutual benefits. But in the end, as it said, one hand cannot clap. The US administration does not seem to be engaging to make a deal.
So we hear one hand cannot clap, the US doesn't want to engage. Is the EU at the mercy of the US?
No, it's not at the mercy of the US, because if EU companies are frozen out because of high tariffs of the American market, they will look elsewhere. Some of the tariffs the EU is imposing will do exactly the same as I described for the US, which is to give opportunities in domestic markets, meaning across the EU, for companies that are no longer able to sell to the United States. And it could well mean that where a consumer today would be buying bourbon whiskey from the US, tomorrow it will be French brandy or Polish vodka that consumer is buying, because all of a sudden the American alternative is too expensive. So you can always see ways in which these things lead to a different pattern of exchange and domestic production. But what you are doing with it sometimes is diminishing consumer choice and making things more expensive for consumers. And this is why there's long been this resistance to having these kind of tit-for-tat trade arrangements. That said, if Trump perseveres with it, and I stressed before what I said before, that he could well change his mind by the end of the week, it may well be that we're going for a relatively more closed economies in which we in Europe, and I include the UK in this, rely on each other rather than on the Americans.
Sure. The EU seems to want to follow through on a free trade agenda nonetheless, so finalising trade deals with India, Thailand, South Korea, Saudi Arabia and other countries in Southeast Asia. Do you think that this is the way to go, taking into account that even not every member state is on board with this? We have Polish and French skepticism towards the trade deal with South American countries.
Yes, there's always going to be contestation within the EU about this or that trade deal. Some will benefit some countries more than others. And one of the reasons for resistance to the deal with Latin America is that the farm communities in the likes of Poland and France have said this is damaging to us. After all, the Argentinians have ranches the size of some European countries. So it's an enormous production capability. But the other side of that is that then if Argentina is buying things from Europe that it would not previously buy, there are going to be opportunities. And you need to look across the European continent to work out where these opportunities arise. It's the whole point of a global trading system. It's Trump's idea is you should balance every single transaction.
Sure.
EU-US should be balanced. Germany-US should be balanced. And that's a silly way of looking at it. As Justin Trudeau famously said, it's dumb.
Okay. Just moving on to markets very briefly. So investors say that markets are sick and tired of the tariff chaos. So yesterday we saw 3 major American indexes drop a little and then they recovered a little. And US officials are now saying that there has to be some pain involved because they are rebuilding the economy. But when might that uncertainty become unbearable?
Well, it's already spooking quite a number of economic agents. And if there's one thing Trump does pay attention to, it is what he's doing to Wall Street and the stock market. So that may be where the most immediate pressure will come onto him to try to tone down some of his more volatile activities.
And also regarding China, so US tariffs on Chinese imports from Trump's first term may provide an indication of where this is all heading. So the only example of the impact of a long-term high tariff policy in place, but the picture is quite complex. So we saw that the imports fell dramatically in 2019, then they recovered, then they fell again in 2023, and then they recovered a bit again. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Well, obviously, between 2019 and 2023, you had, in addition, the pandemic. And for a long time, much longer than in Europe, China was out of the game a bit as a global actor because it closed its borders for health reasons more than for economic reasons. But also, China is very resilient. It's able to adjust its economy in response to these global pressures. Now, certainly, there are episodes where, under the Biden administration, the Americans were trying to restrict Chinese access to certain high specification semiconductors. That was damaging to them. But the consequence of that is they then try to invest in their own capability in these things, and it becomes a boomerang effect where the Americans lose from it rather than gain. So we talk about a trade war. This is really a war only with one protagonist, and that's the US. Everything else is in response to what the US is doing.
Okay. Ian, I'm afraid that's all that we have time for, but as ever, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you again. Thanks.
And we were joined by Ian Begg, professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Thanks so much for being with us today. And I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us every weekday afternoon for The Bottom Line at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and analysis, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.